Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you have been following the news, you know that gender politics is very much in the news these days, as it has been for some time and no doubt will continue to be for some time in the future. So our guest tonight, Tim Goldich, the author of Loving Men, Respecting Women, The Future of Gender Politics.
Thank you. Yes, that's correct. That's very good. You know, there's a natural thing to want to say loving women, respecting men. It gets flipped. See, so it's right. It's the flip of the title is Loving Men, Respecting Women, The Future of Gender Politics. Yes. So thank you, and I'm so glad to be here.
Well, it's good to have you here again. You know, you've been here before, and we've actually talked about this book before, but it's such a topic that seems to demand greater depth and greater examination, so I'm happy to have you back. Well, let's start, as we did last time, let's start with the title, though, because I think that really is important, the idea of loving men, respecting women, which, as you say, is the flip of what we normally think.
That's right, that's right. So one hypothesis I would have is that throughout history, men have been more respected but less loved, women have been more loved but less respected. And that has been a cultural norm, and for millennia, it, I would say, was functional. It worked. And I would say that woman and man were equal partners in creating this gender system, implied an equal overall force of influence in the human system. They were equally responsible for outcomes. And I think that what women suffered, the enormous consequences and vast repercussions suffered by women for being less respected, was matched in full by the enormous consequences and vast repercussions suffered by men for being less loved.
Well, let's stop there for a moment, because I want to go back to something you just said about how both men and women have had an equal role in creating the environment that we live in today. And that runs so counter to the narrative that we hear.
I know.
Which is that men have created the world. It's a patriarchal society. Right. Men hold all the power, and women have been left behind and pushed aside.
Yes.
But your contention is that both sexes are equally responsible for the world we inhabit today.
Absolutely.
So
yes.
So how do we figure that? I mean, how does that square with?
I know, and I'm asking. It's sort of. Well, if I may be so bold, it's like Copernicus coming along and saying, no, the universe is not spinning around us. The Earth is turning, and it's at first very, very difficult to accept. Why do we believe that men have the power and women are the victims? Well, I would say that that's a story that woman and man created in co-equal unconscious collusion. It's a lot of C's, but you know.
Yes, that's a word that gets a lot of currency these days, collusion.
Yeah. Well, and I think it was based and is based on instinct, chivalry, eros. Eros is a huge part of it. It's
Eros, E-R-O-S.
It's like, yeah, it's like an erotic story. It's a story. It's a story of hot, hunky hero male coming to the rescue of the
damsel in distress.
The damsel in distress, and that story's as old as the hills. It goes right back to the mighty Odysseus and the fair Helen of Troy. So, so these things are built deep into the myths and the mythos. Plus, it's reinforced by the physical appearance of men and women and the differing vocal characteristics, things that have little substance logically, but emotionally, psychically, the difference between the sort of rugged, square jaw of the male with his baritone voice versus the sort of childlike, innocent look of the maiden with her sort of dulcet tones is an effect that goes all through us, and I'm no different. It has that effect on me also. But it was never true. It was what I call half of gender reality presented as if it were gender reality in its entirety. And in fact, if we study it enough and go deep enough into it, into sort of forbidden territory, we discover that women's collective power, the sisterhood, was a match for patriarchy.
And how does that play out? How do we see that? What is that power that's matched?
Well, we don't really see it, but what it is it's sexual power, beauty power, it's moral authority, it's motherhood power, it is the greater power to elicit empathy and inflict shame. These kinds of powers have never been studied. They're certainly not taught in school, but they are profound, and through it, woman plays an equal overall force of influence in the human system.
So in your book, you talk about, oh no, of course I'm forgetting the exact phrase, but it all balances out.
Yeah.
In fact, is that the, it all balances out? Is that the
Yeah,
the
that's my
correct phrase?
sound
Okay,
bite. That's my thing.
I
Yeah.
actually pulled that out. But the prevailing narrative today is that it's way out of balance,
Right.
and that what women are trying to achieve is that balance, and that they're a long way away from it.
Yeah.
But I know in your book what you talk about is that women have the power you just described, like the major difference, of course. Women can have children and men cannot.
Mhm.
So in terms of propagation of the species, there is that power that men have, well, I won't say they have nothing to do with it, but it's not something that they can control, whereas women can.
Yes, and the ramifications of that are quite profound. There are many other things too, but motherhood is huge.
And the raising of children.
Yes.
In fact, there's an adage in developing, like the development circles, like the UN development organizations,
Yeah.
that talk about if you educate a man, you've educated a man. If you educate a woman, you've educated a family.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so that women have this extra power of the family at their disposal.
Yes, the social fabric, I would say.
And yet what you talk about a lot in your book is that men are giving up this power that they've had, kind of the patriarchal power, to women, where women will become equivalent in the armed forces, in jobs, in
Yeah.
society, in
Right.
politics, etc. But men are not compensated in any way for giving up that level of power, because they cannot take on the power of bearing children or raising a family or educating a family
Yeah.
or maintaining the social fabric.
Right.
So, and you talk about negotiating this. It can't be a one-way transfer of power. It has to be two-way.
Mm-hmm.
How does that happen? I mean, given that, first of all, well, men will never be able to have children, at least
Right.
it doesn't seem likely. How do you transfer that power given that fundamental imbalance? How do you even it out?
Well, you don't, but you don't seek to make the sexes identical. The two ends of a balance beam need not be identical to weigh the same. Women and men are and have always been equal, not the same, but equal. I would say that men and women have always been about equal in number, evenly matched with equal overall weaponry, and
Now, weaponry, that's a very martial kind of way of thinking.
it's one way of looking at it, but yes, it is. It's weaponry, you know. Well,
Is it really, does it have to be, I mean, do we have to think of it in terms of weapons or
no.
conflict? Is there another way to approach
Absolutely. What I would call equalism. It's really accepting that men and women are equal. And, okay, so what happens? What if I'm right? So it all balances out. What if that's true? What if we looked at it that way? What if that became the default sort of outlook on gender reality? Well, on what legitimate basis will we deeply resent our opposite sex for the various powers, privileges, and exemptions it enjoys when we've come to know that our own sex enjoys powers, privileges, and exemptions in equal measure? Once we come to the realization that the costs each sex pays for their respective privileges are costs that come out even. You see, you can give up all kinds of rage, rancor, resentment, victim, vengeance, all kinds of these poisons that are not valid. If we really looked at it, and I wouldn't expect to live long enough to see these changes happen. These are for distant future, but someday we're going to have to come to grips with the fact that the human system was built on an equal partnership, and that there was no real basis. You see, it's not gender reality; it's gender politics that is creating all this deep resentment between the sexes. There's a certain amount of conflict between the sexes that's inevitable because we have a differing sexual strategies, if you will. So there's a certain conflict that's just basic. You know, that's the battle of the sexes that's been going on since the Pleistocene. But, you know, but this war
Or
of the
maybe
sexes,
before, right?
yeah, but this war of the sexes we see now, this is uncalled for. This is not necessary.
And do you think this is new? Do you get the sense that this is
To this degree, yes. I think the story that I was talking about, men have the power, women are the victims, that had always been sort of romanticized, and more recently it's become politicized.
or weaponized even?
Yes. And that's the difference, and that's what's turned the story from something that was poetic into something that has become poisonous.
But speaking of poisonous, though, I mean, there is the reality of the Harvey Weinsteins of the world.
Yeah,
The
of course.
Me Too movement
Yeah.
addresses a real, and it is a power imbalance, but it is a real abuse
Yes.
coming from one side to the other.
Yes.
That is primarily men against women. It's
Right.
not that women don't ever sexually abuse men, but it's far less often,
I would think so, yeah.
and probably less violent as well in its manifestation.
Yeah.
So how does the thesis you
Yeah.
put forward, how do you interpret this Me Too movement in the context of that thesis if we acknowledge that there is a real problem here?
Well, the central problem with Me Too is that it is me exclusively. It is basically women saying, I am the victim in all things. I'm the powerless victim in all things, and I should draw all empathy, caring, concern, and compassion toward myself. But
is
the facts
is it really that, though? I mean, because the women,
yeah.
like in the Weinstein case, these women were,
Well, I
it would
know.
appear that these women were genuinely
Well, of
sexually
course, I
abused.
get it that they were powerless and victimized in that setting. Yes, and there's more to gender reality than just Me Too. See, as I was saying a little bit earlier, men suffer comparison with women in virtually every measure of well-being. Okay, so
Such as?
Health, mental health, longevity, social services, homelessness, imprisonment. Everywhere through the education system, women are now graduating from college and getting advanced degrees in much larger numbers than men. Women, young, never married women are now well out-earn their male counterparts. All 10 of the 10 most hazardous jobs, as well as the bottom 24 of the 25 worst jobs, as rated by the Jobs Rated Almanac, are all 90 to 100% male occupied, causing men to be 16 times as likely to die on the job as a woman. The men are almost twice as likely to be the victims of violent crime, more than 3 times as likely to be murdered, 3 times higher incidence of substance abuse. For the same crime, a woman and man, a man averages 63% longer prison sentence. Men get their children taken away from them. They die in much, like 97% of all battlefield fatalities. It's no wonder that men are 4.5 times as likely to commit suicide. So Me Too is stealing all focus, but it's half of gender reality presented and demanded to be accepted as if it were gender reality in its entirety, and it is not.
Well, that's interesting that you make the point that, so the position you take is not to in any way diminish what's happening here and what has been shown, but to say let's look at a larger context here.
Yes, and what I would suggest in equalism is what we do is we look at male-female issues as mirrored. We look at them as mirrored. We say that, sexual harassment, what might be the mirror opposite of that? Well, I would say economic harassment. This is what happens to men. And what is that? That can be false paternity suits. That can be false accusations in some cases to exploit. This can be economic harassment.
Alimony?
Well, this can even be marrying some wealthy man with a preconceived idea that you're going to stay married to him just long enough to have a couple of kids and divorce him and leave him and keep the children and the home and the whole. So I mean, and that happens. That can actually happen. In fact, a woman I knew actually did that to a man. So I mean, in other words, there are mirrors that we could be looking at.
There's a George Clooney movie about that, by the way.
Is there really?
Yes,
I didn't know that.
Yes.
I'll have to check that out. But anyway, yes. So what does that do for us? We look at things as mirrored. Well, we reduce a lot of rage. When we're looking at this, you see there remains much to be passionate about. These issues don't vanish what changes when we look at it as in a mirrored way, the attitude, that's what changes. So if I'm with an equalist and she and I are discussing these issues and she goes on about sexual harassment, well, I'm going to be fascinated because I'm fascinated with everything to do with gender. Anything to do with gender is I'm obsessed. So I want to know, how did that feel? What was it like for you?
Mm-hmm.
What exactly went through your mind when that happened? You know, I'm a sponge. I want to know everything about it. But I'll be talking to an equalist. Well, know that we're going to take turns. So we're going to talk about sexual harassment, but then at some point we're going to get to economic harassment, and we're going to talk switch around, and you know, there's going to be a dialogue. See, it's not going to be like just a monologue from a feminist. There's going to be a dialogue.
I think that's so interesting. Now, why do you suppose, I know you do touch on this in the book, but why do you suppose the argument is so one-sided now? Is it that, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but because, I mean, we're not encouraging men to come across as victims, because that, and we don't want to encourage a culture of victimization.
Right.
But
we have encouraged a culture of victimization where women are concerned. And that, I think, is a victimization of women.
And you say in your book that women suffer from that as much as men.
Yes. I see a formula. I see a basic formula. I'm kind of a science head, and I go for formulae. Mm-hmm. And what I see is where men are concerned, it's accountability sans compassion, which is ruthless. It respects men. This is respectful of men as autonomous adults, mm-hmm. empowered adults, responsible for creating their own predicaments and miseries. But it does not love men as vulnerable beings that are often overpowered and have to deal with double binds and so on. Meanwhile, with women, it flips over. So when we're talking of women, it tends to be compassion sans accountability, which is infantilizing, which I think is just as bad.
And so you see this culture of victimization as being an infantilization of women? Is that, am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what a difference to reframe women from powerless pawns under patriarchy to equal partners in the human system. That is conferring respect upon woman and understand respect for her power, respect for her efficacy, respect for her force of influence.
So just to, I mean, and I don't get this impression, but just so our viewers will be sure, you're not advocating in any way that we go back to an old, women in the home and men doing the work. And that's not the message here at all.
Not
right?
at all.
Yeah.
No. This is a progression. So it all balances out. It's not an end point, it's a new beginning. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the day, whenever it should come, that woman and man finally call it even, that's the day that everything begins. Everything positive, everything constructive, mm-hmm. everything that really moves us forward begins on that day. Because right now we're stuck in my victim is bigger than your victim, which goes nowhere. Okay?
Yeah.
So each sex is going to have to take responsibility for its part in this system, mm-hmm. and this wheel of complicity that goes around and around, whereby man applies a force of influence upon woman, and in turn, woman applies an equal overall force of influence upon man. And we also have to understand that each sex is primarily its own worst enemy and largely responsible for creating its own predicaments and miseries. So we have to look at this thing in an even, balanced way. That's what equalism is all about. It's about balancing this whole thing out. And
it's not, if I understand correctly, it's not about, one of the complaints that we hear from men now is about the forced feminization of men.
Yeah.
That somehow it's emasculating them. And that this obviously is reason why men want to rebel against that, because who wants to be emasculated, right? So that's not the message I'm hearing, right? Is that's not what you're, or is it, is there some element of that?
Well, there is some element in that. I would say, we think that women are powerless. Well, okay, so in the realms of gender issues, gender complaint, gender conflict, gender advocacy and activism, gender defining, gender studies, gender politics, gender anything. There is feminism on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is sort of like nothing.
I mean, there's no counterweight to that on
That's right.
male side.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your book the counterweight would be something called masculism.
Yeah, right. I was just coined that term as just to mirror feminism.
But you're saying it doesn't actually exist today.
Well, it does in a small way. Right now what we're calling that is men's rights activism, which is a terrible label that they've chosen. Yeah, the MRA, bless their hearts, they're trying to get the other half of gender reality entered into the equation. And in many ways, their cause is just. Yeah, their public relations is exceedingly poor, but then they're prejudiced against too, though. So you know, for many years, there was something called masculism. That was what Warren Farrell kind of created. I don't know if you've heard of him, but
well, you've mentioned him in your book.
Yeah, he wrote the preface to my book, and they were just the men's movement, the politicized men's movement, really just wanted to be heard. You know, just wanted its facts and truths entered into the equation, and it just got so shut down and so ridiculed and so so much hostility and stonewalling that eventually became angry. And
was it shot down and ridiculed by men or women or both?
By the media, by both. Feminism does not work alone. It works in conjunction with chivalry. See, men don't want to know about the other half of gender reality either. You see, they really don't want to know about female power, and they really don't want to know about male victimization. Men really don't want to hear about their victimization, right? I mean, this is...
Well, no one wants to feel that they're a victim of anything.
Well, if you're a man, yeah, no. Women seem to just eat it up with a spoon, but men do not want to hear it. The eyes go glassy, and they don't want, you try and tell them about all these things that, that are befalling them. It's not how men wish to view themselves. In fact, it's the antithesis of a masculine self-identity. And there's also a wisdom in it. If I internalize victim as an identity or a label, then that's exactly what I am. Why? Because emotional reality is what I make of it, right? Mm-hmm. So if I think of myself as a victim, then that's exactly what I am. But on a gender political level, when men reject the facts of their victimization, then you see they just can't enter into the gender political game or arena.
So is it possible to recognize that one may have been victimized without seeing oneself as a victim?
Absolutely.
And how do you get there? How do you make that
Well,
transition?
that's a huge spiritual journey. By all accounts, there were people in the Nazi concentration camps, rare few, that rejected victim. They would not.
They would not accept that
they would not accept that they were victims. That's very difficult to understand, but you could ask them, so, are you a piano player? Yeah, I'm a piano player. Are you a Jew? Yes, I'm a Jew. Are you a father? Yes, I'm a father. All kinds of labels. Say, yes, I'm this. Are you a victim? No. It's a choice, you see. And I couldn't make it under those circumstances,
But they might also have said, if the question were you victimized, they might say yes.
Right, because then it's not a label, then it's more of a...
It's not an identity, it's did you have this experience?
Right.
Right. So how does, this is a tough question to even formulate, let alone answer, how does one try to move the discussion forward? I mean, you've written this book, and actually it was published in 2011, so this book has been around for a while.
Yeah.
And how do we move things forward? If I quote Albert Einstein, who talked about the splitting of the atom has changed everything save the way man thinks. And so changing thinking is probably one of the hardest things we can do.
Right.
And I sense from the book and from talking to you that that's what's required here, is a change of thinking.
Yes.
So how do we get there? How do we start to get there?
If you could answer that, just let me know. It's very difficult. The emotional investment in this male power, female victimization paradigm is staggering. You know, historically there was an immense emotional investment in the idea that we were at the center of the universe. And that notion appeared to be substantiated by the facts. You looked up at the sky and you could see the stars and the moon and the sun and everything revolving around it. That's what we saw.
In fact, the church persecuted Galileo for making that
Absolutely.
statement. Right?
That's right. It was dogma, and it was punishable by death. That's why Copernicus published his book posthumously, because you know,
he wasn't willing to take that
that's
chance.
right. Right. So, and yet 500 years ago, approximately, the truth came out. Eventually, the facts won people over, and minds were changed. I would say that the male power, female victimization paradigm is equally vulnerable to facts and truths. So why is it still so dominant? I would say it's because the male power, female victimization paradigm is just that much more profoundly emotionally invested. It's really, really going to be difficult for us to change that and look at that.
And it starts, I would think, with what we've just been discussing, to be able to separate out, I might have been victimized, but I am not a victim.
Yeah.
Right? And if you can make that transition, that
Right.
leap of logic,
Yes.
then you're starting along the path.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Right. And if you can look at this as a balanced system with shared responsibility between men and women, we can vastly reduce all this sense of victim and this appalling sense of vengeance and self-righteousness. All this stuff is poisonous. We really need to be looking at gender reality as something that was created in shared responsibility between men and women, and we need to love men more by lending them more empathy, and we need to respect women more by holding her more accountable.
And love men more without making them feel weaker?
Right. So it's not about sympathy. Sympathy is disempowering. Sympathy is poor thing. You know, oh,
yeah.
you poor thing. You
Yeah.
know. And women suffer, and I think women are drowning in that. Empathy is I put myself in your position, I feel what you feel, and I understand you. I offer you understanding and compassion.
And so it's this empathy that we're trying to evoke on both sides, right?
Yes, of course. We already automatically empathize with women, but we do not respect women enough to hold them accountable. And that's a huge challenge, you see, accountability. Well, I like to say it's like medicine. It tastes bad, but it's good for us.
Believe it or not, we have to end on that thought.
Oh my gosh.
That's a pretty good one to end on.
That's a good one, okay.
Right. Tim, I want to thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure to have you back on the show. And this is not an issue that's going away, so I'm sure we'll talk again.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Kevin.
You're welcome.
All right.
And thank you for joining us again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, or see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.